Hi, welcome back to our session 2. Again, this is Roland Legg, and
I'm Sarah McMahill.
we're glad you're with us. Today, we're going to be focusing on racism and homophobia. You're going to, in a moment, hear from some of our speakers talking about how they see that showing up in the world today. Just ask you to be gentle with yourself. This is hard stuff, and it may hit some of us in heavy ways, but I think the Enneagram is a great tool to help us to bring greater hope and understanding to this world. We really am interested to hear how you're experiencing the workshop. So Sarah and I would be always very appreciative to hear from you.
So, Brian, what does racism and homophobia look like for you? How do you see it? How do you experience it?
Well, I would say I get to see it from two sides. For heterosexism, homophobia, I see it from the side of not being in power. And I see the side of being teased, felt less than, from an early age. I can remember being bullied at different times. And I can also remember times of hiding the fact, because it's an invisible thing. So I had a choice. I could hide the fact that I wasn't in relationship, and which was really hard. And it also made me one time tell my story of my husband and I in third person. I was introduced as Mr. X because I was too afraid of where it might lead. And that I will never do again, because it really takes a lot away from your personhood to tell your story in third person. So the racism side, where I'm a person in power just because of my white skin, or what's deemed to be white now, then it's like, I'm almost meant not to see it. And so it's hard to kind of say when it's happening. And I'll admit the story that really helped me understand it comes from shopping with my oldest son, who is Métis, so Indigenous and white background. Obviously, my husband and I adopted him. There was one time he was helping me out. I had a torn ligament in my shoulder, and while waiting for surgery, he went grocery shopping with me every week. And there was one day he was like super, super nervous watching the security guard. And I was like, what? Is he looking at me? Is he looking at me? And I'm like, I don't think so. But I started paying attention to who was looking at my son, who was looking at me, who was looking at us. And what I started noticing is that when we were side by side, we would get the usual 1 in 5 kind of giving a look. As soon as I was like 10 feet in front of the shopping cart, which he was always pushing, not a single person looked at me. And every single person that passed my son looked at him. So that was the first time I really, really took in that I will never know his experience when I'm not there. I will only know the experience we have together, which I knew was different than the experience I have by myself. So for me, racism, I have to be constantly watching for and listening for, because in many ways I'm meant to stay silent, to not notice, to kind of explain it away. And that experience has really helped me be much more attentive to when someone explains they've had a bad day, tell me more, and not to explain away what they've experienced. And then I can give you tons more stories of how he's been treated differently than me.
So you touched a little bit on this, but I'm curious what racism looks like to you.
Well, racism, sadly, looks like any given day walking through the world. And the language that I use for racism is a little bit different than many people. You know, when you are a white-bodied person, you have what I call automatic advantage. And what automatic advantage is it's being able to walk through the world unencumbered, without having people question you as to whether or not you belong in a store, or whether or not you belong in a certain neighborhood, or whether or not you can even bring your children to a certain place to play with other children. So it is being able to move through the world in an unencumbered way without being questioned. Your presence in a space is not questionable to other people. When you are a person of color, you're constantly questioned. And so it doesn't matter if you're shopping in a store and it's a high-end store, do you really belong there? So, you know, you may be shopping and you're going to have security guards keeping their eye on you. When you go to a restaurant, you're very likely to be seated by the restroom or by the workstation. These are things that I call daily indignities. So on any given day, when you're a person of color, you are very likely to run into something that if you were white-bodied, you wouldn't run into. And the extreme example of that, of course, is the situations where you could actually lose your life because you are a Black person or a brown person or an Asian person. These are things that we have to start looking at. We have to start addressing them. And most importantly, I believe that we have to come together as a beloved community of, I call people of color and people who are marginalized, pushed out to the margins of society, love warriors. We are love warriors because we are fighting for our lives. We are fighting for the right to exist in any given space. That includes people who are LGBTQ+. That includes people who are actually struggling with a mental or a physical disability that people will not make an accommodation for. That includes people who, women who are marginalized where it's a male dominant environment. So people who would fall into a category of being marginalized, I call love warriors, because every day we get up and prepare to fight the battle of, you know, we have a right to survive. We have a right to thrive. But we have to connect with what I call a beloved community of allies and advocates. And these are the people who already have the automatic advantage, who want to stand beside us as allies and advocates to actually allow our voices to be heard, to do whatever it will be possible to do to sort of uproot systemic racism and marginalization. The term is called othering. We use that term now because it's all encompassing. It's a recognition that there is a class of people, a class structure that is the dominant norm. And if you are outside of that dominant norm, and there are some shifts as to what that looks like around the world. In the United States of America, it's a white male dominant norm followed by a white female dominant norm, and then everybody else falls out underneath that. And it's also a white male cisgendered norm, which means white male cisgendered because you accept the gender that you were assigned at birth. That's our dominant norm in this culture. Everyone else is sort of, according to rank, you fall out underneath. But what people need to remember is we are one race and it's called human. And we have to come together. People who are marginalized, people who are discriminated against, people who are considered other, we will not be the ones that end this. It will actually be the connection between our allies and our advocates that will disassemble this systemic scourge that we live with in this country.
What does racism look like for you? And what does homophobia look like to you?
Well, I grew up in East Texas in the 1950s and 60s. And so my memories of racism was pretty much the earliest memories I have are of the separate bathrooms and the separate water fountains, very much instilled in me. As a child, it just looked like that's the way the world was, is that there's two kinds of people and we're better than they are. This is what I was taught. And that we're not supposed to mix. We're not supposed to be in the same school or the same church or the same anything, restaurant, whatever. That's the way I was raised. And my father was definitely a white supremacist, and he would let me know that if you weren't a WASP, you were lower than what we were. I mean, that's the way I was raised. And my mother did not believe that, and she became a Christian when I was in first grade, 1960. And so I would learn all these different things in church that didn't match up with what my father taught me. And I remember questioning it and trying to figure out what the deal was really early on. And with homosexuality, I mean, it's like, I just remember noticing that certain children, that one girl I went to camp with seemed like a boy and acted like a boy to me, and boys that I went to dance class with seemed like girls. Like I didn't know, about sexual preference, but very early on, because I was an actor and I was in the arts, dancing, and I was definitely around it. And I also was an athlete. And so when I went to college and I was in the PE department, I would meet all these girls that had girlfriends. And, this was a long time ago. I'm 67 years old, but I was just curious and fascinated. And I also, because of being raised Christian, I knew that there were laws supposedly that said that wasn't right. And it really wasn't. I think it was Anita Bryant came out in the late 70s, early 80s. And Anita Bryant, I know, Sarah, you don't know, but maybe Roland remembers her. She came out against homosexuality, and she was a Miss America, and she was a spokesperson for orange juice. And I challenged my mother. I just remember going to my mother. I was probably 19 or 20. And I said, how can that be Christian if they judge or hate somebody because of who they're attracted to? I mean, it just didn't make sense to me. So that, that's sort of the early awarenesses and consciousness of this hatred. That's what it looked like. Not anymore, of course. I'm looking at it from totally different lens, completely, totally, profoundly. But I'm just letting you know from a child's eye view that both of these things, one through religion and one through my father's belief systems and his fears, that's what it looked like.
So for you, Catherine, what does racism and homophobia look like?
When I saw you share this question, it gave me quite a pause, because I feel like there's such a very specific example of what racism or homophobia can look like that comes to mind when we see these words. We can immediately think of acts of violence, especially, that can come up around racism and homophobia. At least that's images that come into my head pretty quickly. But I do think that racism and homophobia, what they look like, can be such a wide variety. It can be such a range. You might not even know that's what you're looking at until you're looking at it from this lens of anti-oppression. And so what does racism and homophobia look like? It can be in costume. It can be, it could be clear as day, where we're seeing a clearly like a violent act happening, where someone is using slurs or something very overt and obvious, that what we're being faced with right now is a racist or homophobic act. But then we have these really covert, hidden, sneaky examples of what racism and homophobia can look like, that can kind of crop up on us. So those can look like policies where the wording is suddenly a little bit more coded. For example, in the 13th Amendment, we did emancipate slavery. We're like, let's abolish that. We're no longer doing it. But there's a little clause that says, unless someone's a criminal. Like, I'm from the States, so my relationship to racism and homophobia is really defined a lot by my upbringing in the United States, and I live in Canada now. And while they have very similar origin stories, a lot of my reference points for policy are for the United States still. But so there's that little clause that also says, if someone's a criminal, then yes, we can enslave them, essentially. Like, they can do labor for us, they can be incarcerated. And so when you have a clause like that, you can apply it to a particular group of people. And then now you have essentially legalized slavery. And so examples like that is racism can be sly and covert and hidden, but it's still very much there and entrenched within the organizational structures or infrastructures of our world. So really hard to describe specifically what does it look like. But I think, there's a quote that comes to mind as well. I don't know, it's maybe, okay, I'll just say it, but it's over PG-13. So I believe there was a judge, I want to say, in the States, thank you, who said something to the effect of like, I can't define what porn is, but I know what it is when I see it. Yeah. And so I think it's a comparable thing, and not to shame sex work in any way, of course, in relationship to this, but racism and homophobia can be one of those things that you don't even really know what you're looking at until you see it. Does that help, or does that define what it looks like?
Yeah. Okay. I just have one follow-up. Yeah. I have this question, since you have the unique experience of growing up in the US and now for several years living in Canada.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you notice any sort of differences in how the two countries' cultures deal with racism and homophobia. If it's any different.
This is a great question.
At all.
They have really similar origin stories. So they have so we have a very interesting shared interwoven history, especially as the borders between what is considered Canada and the United States are drawn later, you know, I feel like they're a lot more similar than either Canada or the US would like to admit. I think that Canada has a really huge reputation for being a kinder, more friendlier place. And because they didn't have the same relationship, especially to, say, slavery, they had a lot more spaces of refuge for people to retreat from slavery, for example. People would flee to the north. But I think from what I've understood from people's lived experience and history here in Canada is that it was often a really disenchanting experience to also arrive here in Canada and feel like they were being faced with the same things that they were faced with back in the States. And so, you know, there here in Alberta, for example, there were places where land was being advertised, because part of colonization is also encouraging your constituents to occupy more space and land. So the government of Canada was encouraging a lot of people to move here, and you know, in flocks so that they could occupy more space more easily. And so there were a lot of particularly Black folks who were interested in going to Canada and would start these farming communities here, say like in Alberta as an example. And as soon as so many Black people started coming here, they suddenly were like trying to deter more Black people from coming. They were like, oh no, you won't like it. Don't, it's very cold. It's terrible. You'll hate it. So they were facing the same discrimination when they arrived, even if it was a little more coverted, and it was more legal for them to participate in society for to the same extent. But still shitty. That's still a bad, you know, that's not a good deal. And so I would say that I think that Canada has a different way of, like, with the mindset of being, how do I want to say this? They have the mindset of being friendlier people, but a lot of the laws are similar. The origin story is really similar. The relationship to how we have policing in the country is similar. They just have a different, I think, relationship to the UK and Britain, and how that relationship kind of shaped the direction either of these two areas kind of went. So I don't know. I think that it's better to be here, at least for me as a queer person. My rights as an individual haven't been debated as recently as they were in the United States. When my partner and I got married in the States, it wasn't legal yet. And that shouldn't be the case. I'm so young and I got married not too long ago. So that's really recent. It was 2014 when my partner and I got married, and it was not legal federally in the United States. And so to think that that was not that long ago at all, that we had to go to Canada to get married, is baffling, honestly baffling. So I guess with like the 2016 election in particular, in the United States, which was the catalyst for my partner and I to move to Canada, which is their homeland, federal legalization of our union was so fresh. It was only a year old. In 2015, it was federally legalized. So the idea of living a place where it felt like someone could take that right away from me again, or fight it so that it was not available to me, was really scary. So moving here felt more like a breath of fresh air for me as a queer person, because my individual rights, such as being able to marry whomever I want, weren't going to be as readily debated or feel as freshly offered to me. So I would say there was more safety here for me as a queer person than there was in the United States on that basis alone. Yeah.
Thanks, Katie. That's,
Yeah.
appreciate your sharing.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I'm curious what racism looks like.
So my personal direct experience is limited, maybe partially because I was lucky to grow up in Asia and have a greater sense of self-worth related to that. But there was an incident which I told you separately about when I was traveling in Europe with my classmates during our backpacking holidays, where in one occasion, a lady selling fruit in a train station absolutely refused to serve me. And I thought she just couldn't understand my language. And so I was trying again. And I finally realized what it was. And so all the stories that you hear about all come home to hit you personally. And although it's just one thing, and I had the equanimity to take it in stride or process it, in a certain way, you never forget that one incident ever. And that's a good thing, because it means that I can understand others, even though it's so much worse for what many have gone through, but it's a gateway, a key for what's going on. And it also tells me that if one little thing can get to a person, imagine how much systemic racism can hurt people. There have been other incidents, like when my mother married my father, she was pulled aside in the British marriage bureau and asked, "Do you realize what you're doing?" So yeah, it's there.
I'm curious how you observe in other situations with people around you incidents of racism.
Yeah, there was an African American who was hired into the company I was working at, and there was I think people are generally polite on the surface, but it was harder for him to have social interactions outside of work. And and he did try. There's nothing wrong with him, but there, it's kind of there. I think people get relaxed when they get to know people over time, but there's still a barrier to how far it will go. And then the rest is stories. And the stories I would hear would actually be more stories against women even than the race part, because there's so many more women, that you're dealing with, but it's a similar kind of hurt, right? So you have one female employee saying to me that she asked for a raise, during her review, and and she's white, and the boss says to her, "Why do you need a raise? You're married, you've got a husband." So if that's happening to her, I'm sure it's. I mean, I do hear the stories. I watch movies about what's being, the history of how other races have been treated.
That's very your stories connect what I observe out there in the world. And one of the places I notice, I think I often notice it more outside of my own community, because you get so used to seeing things in your own community. So I notice it at airports. I notice it going through immigration. I notice white people go sailing through, a person of color, gets stopped and asked extra questions, told, taken off. And
so you're right, Roland, because I remember now a friend told me, and she was the boss, and she had a white employee with her, and she would be the one inevitably on business trips that would be pulled over and have her luggage checked. And yeah, she felt it, and she challenged the immigration officers on it, but she felt it, and then I know somebody who is a Sikh professor, with a turban, and a professor at Singapore University, which is one of the 10 top universities in the world recognized, going through American, customs and immigration just on a visit, and like being told, "You're a professor." And then his son, who was living in America, visited Canada, went back into the States, and was pulled aside just based on visual. Handsome fellow, but a turban, right? So, although in his case, he acquired an American accent, so as soon as he opened his mouth, they were like, "Oh, you're one of us. So it's okay, it's okay." So that taught me that it's not, with some people, they just need to be relaxed in certain ways. Like if they get to know you or think they know you because there are more similarities coming through, there's more hope for working with those people.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
What does racism look like for you?
Ooh, racism, it looks a lot of different ways, which makes it even more tricky for people who don't recognize racism now to see. But it used to be blatant. It used to be overt, right? You used to know, like, oh, that person's racist, right? And people used to be proud to be racist, right? It was a thing like, yeah. But now it's covert now. So it is racism are in subtleties in the way that people treat you, subtleties in the way they look at you. Laws and policies aren't necessarily subtle, but they are subtle ways that enforce racism and racist structures that impact people. And so it looks like in so many ways it looks, that's the interesting part about it. So it looks like maybe a school not having the same resources, a school in a Black neighborhood or Latino neighborhood, or not having the same resources as a school in a more affluent neighborhood that majority of people live there, maybe white or rich. So like it just looks different in the way that economics and resources are displaced. It looks different in the way that maybe someone treats me compared to if my skin was lighter, right? Even in marketing and different things in social media and like media, the way things are. And I think the world is trying to shift that, but it's really more for a dollar than to actually care for people. We're still working on the care part, but it's the way that people treat people and see people. And you can feel it. It's not always very like overt, even though there's still a lot of overt racism, but it's covert a lot of times. You see it as small things that people do. And slick things people do, the words people say about you, and categorize you, or give you less benefit of the doubt, or the way that the interactions with many police for Black people happen still to this day, unfortunately, right? So yeah.
Russell, what does racism and homophobia look like? What does it look like for you? How do you experience it in the church?
Well, over the years, particularly homophobia, it's much better than it was because we have fought hard to shift things. But for me, it looked like, well, initially it was hiding myself. As a teenager, I knew that I was gay, but I had a message, even though I was in a liberal United Church, but a very conservative local congregation. Somewhere in that messaging socially, I don't ever remember hearing it named in the congregation, in the church. I knew it was wrong, quote unquote. And so I repressed it, put it aside, and buried it. But it didn't go away. And so for me, it was being in the closet was how it kind of was the reality for the longest time. And as I moved into adulthood, started learning a bit more, meeting one other person initially who identified as gay. And it kind of grew from there. And then when the church started talking about it, it gave me permission to learn more and educate myself about the issues because there were resources easily available, and to discern. And I also grew up in as I said, a conservative congregation, and that had an influence in some of the circles I was in. And so I had this tension of still kind of struggling whether it was right or wrong in the eyes of God, and learning about kind of both sides of the issue, of the perspectives. And it came down to one summer, I found myself obsessed with trying to figure it out as I worked in the oil field, in a pretty mindless job, which gave me lots of mental time to occupy myself. And finally just gave it up to God and said, this is bigger than me. And if it is wrong, then I know that you can change me. And if it's not, then I can live it to your glory. Basically, that was the kind of prayer that I said in my faith stance at the time. And so then by that fall, I kind of reflected on, I mean, I didn't stop thinking about it per se, because I was continuing to educate myself, go to workshops, read articles that the church was putting out. And so in the fall, I reflected on what I had experienced. And what I had experienced on the side that was against homosexuality was a lot of fear and hate and yeah, not a lot of love. A rejection, that's the other word. And on the other side, I experienced love and acceptance and grace. I didn't know this God. This is the God that I knew. And that was my answer in terms of God loves me, accepts me as I am. So that moved me forward to then being more open, but still realizing the church wasn't really a safe place yet. So when I was in Lloydminster, I was in the closet, and that's when I met Brian, my present husband of 35 years. It became really clear, he was in Ontario and I was in Lloydminster, it became really clear it wasn't safe for him to move there. Because as we started our relationship and we're talking about being together. So I quit that congregation and moved to Toronto. And worked outside of the church, still in kind of church-related organizations, but not in congregations for, well, 6 years in an outreach ministry, and then started moving back into part-time congregational positions while I looked for something full-time. So another way that it's impacted us, is through adoption, because in our journey, we decided that we wanted to have children, and were encouraged when we explored about fostering or adoption to apply. And we went through the whole process, had a home study, were approved, and then got caught in a vicious cycle of the agency saying, we can't proceed with you because you're a couple, and we don't have kind of policy for that. And we can't proceed with you as a single parent because we know that you're a couple. And so we were kind of left in limbo, and they directed us toward fostering because that might eventually lead to adoption. Although the fostering and adoption departments didn't talk to each other, because so that really didn't feel like an option when we got into it. But anyways, it did eventually lead to adoption as we proved ourselves as a good family, a good home, and adopted 2 children. And we also, because of lesbians that had broke the ground a few years before around step-parent adoption, we still had to adopt as a single parent. So one of us adopted the child, and then because of the previous legal cases that approved step-parent adoption for lesbians, we were the first couple in Ontario to adopt as a couple through the step-parent adoption. So those are the kinds of things that the concrete and blatant kind of experiences of homophobia and heterosexism that I've experienced. And with regard to racism, like, I'm very white, so I'm become very much aware of my white privilege. Our oldest son is Indigenous. And so we've become very aware of the racism he's experienced over the years. And Brian speaks about when he had his show, Tyler would go with him and would notice that if he wasn't right beside Tyler, the way Tyler was treated and watched in the store was very different. And so there's that kind of assumptions that just exist, that he looks Native, he must be wanting to steal something. And even this past month, the 2 of them had to go to Ontario for a funeral of his sister. And they were without a credit card because Jessica, his fiance, had lost her credit card, and we're trying to book a hotel. And Jessica had worked at hotels, so knew about things like pre-authorizations, and had called us to see if we could do a pre-authorization. But while I was on the phone, she started a conversation with the manager about, like, she, I think, had the idea, oh, I have my work credit card, can I use it for pre-authorization and then pay with my debit card? Nope, that wouldn't be possible. We don't accept debit or cash. And so she's like, so you don't accept any transactions in this hotel using debit or cash? No. And so this went back and forth for a little bit, and then Tyler's sister's boyfriend stepped up and said, I can look after it and you can pay me later. And he's white. And he was asked, how would you like to pay? And we learned later that he was able to pay with debit the next morning. So it was blatant that they were making assumptions based on who she was and how she looked. Even with, and they didn't know I was white, but like me on the phone ready to support them with the credit card. So it's just so endemic in our system that stuff happens that we assume it isn't going to happen because we're better than that, but we're not.
I'm curious also if you could maybe comment as a Canadian. I think Canadians sometimes thinks we're more innocent than we are.
Mm-hmm.
Anything to say about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. What we kind of hear about and talk about in Canada is that our racism is more subtle. And I've had conversations with people of color, Indigenous and Black, around that. And I think my sense is that as white people, we think it's subtle, but they don't experience it as subtle at all. It's very blatant and obvious. And it is very different, I think, than the US, because we have a different history. But that doesn't make it any less insidious or hurtful or difficult.
Yeah.
For BIPOC folk.
Yeah. I agree with you as a Canadian. Yeah.
And so I live in Minnesota, and I think because we're so close to Canada, that some of that even trickles down into Minnesota, and probably even to some of the other states that border Canada. But at least that's been my sense. So,
although we again, thinking about that comparison, we would think that we would never have a police officer in a city put their knee on someone's neck for 8 minutes, right? And yet we see that kind of violence if we're watching for it, or if we are following the right media, all the time in our Indigenous protests. And many of us, particularly those of us who are aware of these issues, have been outraged at the trucker protest that just happened, knowing that if those were Black or Indigenous people, there is no way it would have gotten to the point that it did. Mm-hmm. And so it's really infuriating to see that kind of difference. And yeah, can't just think of the word, but it's beyond that.
So, what does racism look like, and what does homophobia look like for you?
Yeah, so it's so insidious and subtle and just like all over the place. I think that it's more like racism and homophobia are like the waters that we swim in, and it's not that it's like rare and so it's hard to spot, but it's everywhere, and so it's hard to imagine how things could be different because of how pervasive it is. of course, incidents of acute violence are the easiest to point to. Recently in Minneapolis, police burst into the home of Amir Locke, a teenager who was sleeping on a couch and who legally owned a gun, and so who picked up that gun, and they shot him twice in the chest and once in the wrist. And that is, like clearly it's such an acute and obvious thing to point to and say, there was a failure on several levels here, a failure of policy, because, I mean, not to get too in the weeds, but like Amir Locke died because of a no-knock raid, and no-knock raids were supposedly banned by our mayor last April. So here we see like policy and like what is allowed tactically playing into it. But also, I think that there's much subtler and internal racist dynamics here of what happens in split moment decisions when white police officers are engaging with young Black people, and what, like these like subtle embodied experiences that is so deeply ingrained that sometimes it's not even like prefrontal cortex thinking about it stuff. It's like reptilian brain instincts, nervous system thinking about stuff. And that's why we do our work is as a church, but also as Enneagram practitioners, because racism won't just be fixed by good policy, though surely good policy is needed. It also requires a certain measure of inner work and even healing for our society to be able to rid ourselves from these negative and destructive instincts that are so ingrained in us.
Well, Sarah, we've got some big issues to have a conversation about in this section of our course. And I think the question is, how does racism and homophobia show itself today? I think that the problem is that it shows itself in ways that are often very subtle. It happens in those microaggressions. But I think the most important thing about the Enneagram is it helps us, each of us, to take responsibility for how we show up in the world. And first of all, we have to admit that we are capable of being racist, that all human beings show some form of prejudice, how easy it is for us to blame somebody else for something that we don't like about ourselves, how easy it is to put someone else down just to help us make ourselves feel better about ourselves. So, that's always been a big step for me, is to admit that I'm part of this. It's not just something that other people do. It's something that I get caught up in.
And another part of that is, I think it can come out as us trying to give advice. So I recently had a conversation with someone who was blind, and she knows how to read Braille. And she kept on hearing from other people, oh, you can just learn the music by ear. So we don't need to do any of the translation of the music into Braille for you. You can just do it by ear. And she was so frustrated at that insistence of somebody else of just learning something by ear. She should have that option to be able to do that. And so that's just, it comes across as a microaggression to the other person, but from the person who's saying it, it's like they're trying to think of probably the best way to help someone, when in fact it's really not helping.
Mm-hmm. It makes me think, I grew up as a left-handed person, and the world is built for right-handed people. And sometimes it was always a struggle to try and find left-handed scissors, or I just learned to eat with my right hand because that's what everybody else did. And it's frustrating, or how tables are set up, or If you're writing in a book, it's really difficult for a left-handed person to write in a scrapbook because it's somehow it's the wrong way around. So it makes it more difficult. And so something as simple as being left-handed, I mean, it wasn't a huge stress on me, maybe as a child, but still people were just making the assumption that the world is right-handed. And then meeting a fellow that when I was doing homemaking in Toronto, came from Scotland to Canada, and he had been whipped so many times as a child for being left-handed. His wrist was damaged for the rest of his life. Because back in those days, they thought that if you were left-handed, you had the mark of the devil on you. And so people get caught up in these things. I think it's just when the majority just assume this is normative and they can't see any other way of expressing themselves in the world, whether that if you're right-handed, well, everybody must be right-handed. It's the strange ones who are left-handed, or around sexual orientation, the normative is heterosexual, but then there's sort of expectations that anyone who isn't, there's something wrong with them and that they have to change. Not the people who are in the majority need to change, or find a way of each giving something to it so we can find a way that both honors everyone in the group.
Mm-hmm. Just kind of got me thinking back to something I learned about very early on around the time of Jesus, where the left hand was actually used for wiping the butt. So of course they didn't do anything with their left hand because that was reserved for wiping yourself, and the right hand was for eating. So just kind of being reminded, like, there's a bit of a history behind that. They didn't have use the left because he was dirty from something else. The connotations of that just morphed over time. So it's not necessarily bad. It's just something that was historically not used because of a different reason.
Yeah. And how easy it is to get caught up in stereotypes. I just remember this was after 9/11, and I was sitting on a plane beside a man who had a turban on. And he was fine, and I knew there was nothing wrong. But there was this irrational fear in me. Rational fear, turban means someone who's violent, which of course there's absolutely no truth to.